In overview, the blood takes up oxygen in the lungs, transports it through circulation system, and upon arriving in vicinity of the tissue cells, releases the oxygen. This is the whole cycle of the mission. In micro view, oxygen is released only while the RBCs are inside the capillary vessels. This restraint is very important. Always keep it in mind. Therefore, to maximize oxygen supply, you have to drive more and more fully oxygenated RBCs into capillaries. The more RBCs are passing through the capillary every moment, the more oxygen is having chance to be released. To achieve this objective, let's see how many ammunitions are available. First, the vasculature, or blood vessels, which decides the amount of blood flow passing by the tissues. When a small artery reaches an organ, it branches off into numerous smaller vessels called arterioles. The volume of blood flowing through an organ can be regulated by adjusting the diameter of these arterioles. Arterioles branch further within the organs into capillaries, only inside which RBCs release oxygen. More blood flow means more RBCs having chance to enter the capillary. Generally, blood vessel has much redundancy in its capacity. However, when vasculature integrity is compromised, as in thrombosis, multiple sclerosis in the artery wall, or microcirculation disturbance in arterioles, the blood flow to a specific tissue can be in shortage. Microcirculation disturbance is most commonly arising problems causing regional hypoxia and accordingly the regional diseases. For example, most pain symptoms, most brain problems, nephritis, and so on. However, in clinical practice, microcirculation disturbance is less paid of attention, or in many cases, even neglected. I will elaborate the formation, cause of, and the solution to the microcirculation disturbance at the next section. Second, blood oxygenation, which means RBCs taking up oxygen at the lungs. Surely, the more oxygen the blood carries, the more oxygen is available for release in capillaries. Two factors are in work: RBC count and the hemoglobin concentration. Lower than normal range of RBC count is called anemia. And the other, hemoglobin, which resides inside the RBC, responsible for capturing and holding the oxygen. Obviously, the more hemoglobin inside each RBC, the more oxygen is captured and held. Iron deficiency causes shortage in hemoglobin synthesis, resulting in iron deficiency anemia. To sum up, as long as you are free of these two types of anemia, your blood surely carries enough oxygen. It is sure that the higher the hemoglobin concentration and the higher the RBC count in each unit of blood flowing the arterioles, the more of oxygen is likely to enter the capillary for release. And the third, oxygen release. This step is mostly neglected, both in everyone's daily life and clinically. So far, doctors seem to take it for granted that as long as your blood carries a sufficient amount of oxygen, you are supposed to be free of hypoxia. Obviously, that idea is wrong because most elderly adults are hypoxic, but their blood generally carries sufficient amount of oxygen, given the fact that most of them are anemia-free. What makes doctors think that way is the fact that they almost totally neglected the step of oxygen release, as if this step is never out of whack. The step of oxygen release is very volatile, and there is plenty of room for improvement for almost everyone, no matter young or old, so as to markedly boost oxygen delivery for most people, especially most of those who are less energetic. For example, the elder adults. The step of oxygen release is so important that most modern diseases are rooted in it, according to my observations in the past 11 years. Okay, let's zoom in to see how this step works. 3 factors work in concert. First, and the most vulnerable factor, the flexibility of RBC. I'm sure most likely none of you ever heard of this term before. So what is RBC flexibility? I told you a few minutes ago that oxygen is released only while RBCs are inside the capillary vessels. The problem is the inner diameter of the capillaries, about 4 to 6 micrometer, is smaller than the size of RBCs, which is 7 to 8 micrometers. How can you make larger RBCs get inside the smaller lumen of a capillary? That is exactly where RBC flexibility comes into play. Normal RBCs can be flexible enough to be fully deformed and squeezed into the capillary. That's very like a fully deflated balloon, which can be deformed to any form, any size. Just like this. This balloon is like a RBC, far bigger in size than this tube, which represents the capillary vessel. See, with a full deformation, the balloon is readily able to enter this tube and pass through it. By the same mechanism, even though larger, RBCs are able to enter and pass the capillary. Problem is, what if the RBC is less flexible or rigid? And in fact, they are rather volatile in flexibility or rigidity. The rigid RBCs have small chance to enter the capillary. Without entering the capillary, there is no chance at all to release oxygen, because RBCs release oxygen only while they are inside the capillary. No better choice, most of these rigid RBCs have to flow directly to the venule and get back to the heart with oxygen unreleased at all. That is like a fully loaded trucks arriving at the destination and without unloading any cargo, simply returning to the starting point. Obviously, that is a tremendous waste of kinetic energy created by the heart and a waste of a condensed resource of vasculature. Even worse, these rigid RBCs keep flowing in the circulation system without rest, rarely having chance to unload the oxygen they carry. With these rigid RBCs not releasing the oxygen, the blood can be high in oxygen carrying capacity, but low in oxygen delivery capacity. The more number of rigid RBCs are there, the lower the efficiency of oxygen delivery by the blood. For example, say there are 10 cc of blood passing a capillary bed in a given moment. It is possible that, say, 80% of the total RBCs in the blood flow enters capillary for oxygen release. On the contrary, with a vast number of rigid RBCs in blood, it is possible that, say, only 60% of total RBCs in the blood flow enters the capillary. I mean, the parameter of RBC flexibility can cause significant hypoxia. You can easily appreciate its detrimental effect by comparing the elderly adult population and the youngsters. Their key distinction stems exactly from their difference in average flexibility of RBCs. And there is another scenario in which these rigid RBCs enter the capillary by chance, but they will make the capillary slightly bulged up, creating strong friction with the capillary wall, which obviously impedes the movement of these RBCs, which means they take longer than normal length of time passing through the capillary. Consequently, even the normal RBCs flowing behind them have to keep the same slow pace passing through the capillary. As a result, the number of RBCs entering the capillary per minute is decreased. Therefore, the amount of oxygen released per minute decreased as well, which virtually brings about hypoxia. Imagine you have a large number of rigid RBCs in your blood. Your blood becomes very inefficient in releasing oxygen to tissues across your body. And you become bodily hypoxic, even if your blood carries sufficient amount of oxygen. This is exactly why the elderly adults are generally less energetic. Exactly, their blood is higher in the number of rigid RBCs than youngsters. Next, let's see what factors cause RBC rigid. Overnutrition, stress, and aging all contribute to the impairment of RBC flexibility. Overnutrition includes high level sugar and a high fat level. Yes, high level of sugar and high level of fat cause hypoxia by impairing RBC flexibility, and in turn, hypoxia causes variety of health problems. That's why you see the complications of diabetes, and that's why you can observe the correction of a high level of fat brings about comprehensive health improvement. Aging is accompanied by variety of chronic diseases as well, which is also due to hypoxia caused by principally by impaired RBC flexibility. Stress and hypoxia promote production of free radicals, which impair RBC flexibility as well. Stress is also responsible for formation of a microcirculation disturbance, which will be elaborated later. It is a kind of a consensus that overnutrition, stress, and aging are closely related with most chronic diseases. Coincidentally, all these three factors impair RBC flexibility. Now, you should realize the problem of impaired RBC flexibility is widespread. Accordingly, hypoxia is permeated in modern human life. Don't forget, hypoxia causes variety of health problems because oxygen is fundamental to all the biological activities of almost every cell. We can better understand the hypoxia causing overall health problems by observing those with anemia or those who freshly come to high altitude. The list of health problems caused by these two scenarios is very long. That surely includes all those prevalent chronic diseases. However, in clinical practice, there seems no any idea or intentional effort made in treating hypoxia caused by impaired flexibility of RBCs. In other words, RBC flexibility has been totally neglected clinically, to my best knowledge. Weird enough, though, there are a huge number of research papers available regarding RBC flexibility. You can find the related papers by searching keywords like RBC flexibility, RBC rigidity, or RBC deformability in the scholar site of Google. In other words, in laboratory, the importance of RBC flexibility has been established, while in clinical practice, it remains neglected. Next, we move on to the second factor affecting the step of oxygen release, RBC diameter. Under deficiency of either vitamin B12 or folic acid, the diameter of RBC is abnormally large upon their maturation, called macrocytes, more than 10 micrometer, at least 25% larger than normal RBCs, which are 7 to 8 micrometer only. With macrocytes, the similar problem occurs as in impaired flexibility of RBCs. The reason is obvious. Inner diameter of a capillary is too small in comparison with macrocytes. Therefore, when the number of macrocytes climbs to a certain extent, the oxygen delivery efficiency of the blood is so severely compromised that it is called pernicious anemia in medical terms. The last factor in work at the step of oxygen release is a carbonic anhydrase, which resides inside the RBC, just like a hemoglobin. Oxygen is of a gas, therefore, in factory or in hospital, it is compressed in air-proof tanks. And to release the oxygen, you have to turn the air valve of the tank. Similarly, hemoglobin is like the oxygen tank. It captures and holds the oxygen molecules. And the carbonic anhydrase is like the air valve, which can turn on hemoglobin to release oxygen, while RBCs are inside the capillary. The subject on how carbonic anhydrase works is saved in this lecture. But you should remember one thing, that the metal element zinc is essential for the proper functioning of a carbonic anhydrase. To sum up, to maximize oxygen delivery efficiency of blood, there are at least 5 factors to be optimized. And they are all about RBCs, such as RBC count, hemoglobin concentration, which resides inside RBC, RBC flexibility, RBC diameter, and lastly, carbonic anhydrase, which also resides inside RBCs. As long as you are less energetic or planning to be fully energetic, no matter young or old, you should optimize all these 5 factors. Based on my observations in the past 11 years, I summarized the following 5 points which must be helpful to improve oxygen delivery efficiency of the blood for anyone. First, to have optimum RBC count, I suggest put vinegar into your regular dietary by any means. Vinegar presumably improves the efficiency of various enzymes by means of acetylation, including those enzymes involved in proliferation of RBCs. For your information, metabolite of alcohol is acetic acid, which is the essential ingredient of vinegar. Therefore, appropriate drinking alcohol regularly is good for maintaining optimum RBC count. Second, to have a sufficient concentration of hemoglobin, you should regularly take foods high in iron. For example, red meat, cloud air fungus, and so on. Third, to maintain the best flexibility of RBC, I recommend a soft gel product codenamed X Soft Gel, true name of which is hidden for the sake of eliminating commercial smell. I have personally taken this X Soft Gel for 11 years, and all my pioneering work on hypoxia is based on my observations on users of X Soft Gel. Drinking tea is also helpful to RBC flexibility, but far behind exercise. Full rest and good sleeping are also required for good flexibility of RBCs. Keep it in mind, the flexibility of RBC worsens with aging if no proper maintenance is given. Fourth, to have a normal size of RBCs, you should regularly take whole spectrum of nutrition required by RBC development, including folic acid, vitamin B12, among other vitamins. If all foods are heated during preparation, one is likely to be deficient of folic acid, which is extremely vulnerable to heat. For vitamin B12, meat, beans, and nuts are helpful. If you have a gastrointestinal issue, you may have to take special care of a vitamin B12 supplement. Fifth, to have a sufficient amount of carbonic anhydrase, regular uptake of foods high in zinc is important. If you have gastrointestinal issue, you may have to take special care of a zinc supplement. The method above is called OTEC, standing for oxygen therapy by improving erythrocyte quality, which is quite comprehensive and effective, possibly most inclusive in the world. You may have noticed that all 5 factors can be properly maintained by proper dietary and lifestyle, unless you have a gastrointestinal issue. That's why I think dietary habit is most important for anyone's health. And throughout this lecture, when I mention about RBC quality, it refers to all 5 factors above. When RBC quality is in optimum state, least blood flow is required to easily deliver oxygen as much as needed by the tissue cells. Less blood flow requirement means bigger redundancy in vasculature. For example, if a metabolism rate suddenly surges to an extreme high in specific tissue, with the best RBC quality, the circulation system can meet the peak oxygen demand without dilating the arterioles to their upper limits. On the contrary, if RBC is inferior in quality, it cannot meet the peak oxygen demand of the tissue, even if dilated arterioles to their upper limits. Okay, now we think about this scenario. What if metabolism rate suddenly rises to an extreme, like emotional trauma, which requires a peak amount of oxygen supply, and the arterioles are dilated to its upper limit, and the maximum amount of blood flow possible is drawn in, yet still unable to meet the oxygen demand of the tissue? What's going to happen? It brings us the issue of a microcirculation disturbance. Let's move on.